All right, this morning we begin a new 13-week series of study from the book of Judges. When it comes to the book of Judges, the first question that most people ask is, what are we talking about? Well, we are talking about, in the book of Judges, a historical period approximately 400 years long, a period of time. The period of the Judges, as we know it, falls chronologically after the conquest recorded in Joshua, which ends at about 1400 BC, and before the ascension of one Saul to the throne in about 1050 BC. Now, we're going to have a lot of slides today and every week. And if you would like copies of these slides, send an email to the church office or my email, and we can get you copies of each one of these slides. This is why I don't use clickers. I never use them for this reason. They never work when you want them to. Yeah, there we go. All right, there we go. So the big picture here, you have Genesis, which expands somewhere. It depends on your desire to date the earth. Expands somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years, again, depending on how you date the earth. The end of Genesis, and thankfully we just finished that study. You have the establishment of God's covenant with Abraham. The covenant was reiterated to his son Isaac, through his son Jacob, and through the 12 sons that we witnessed over the last few weeks in the 12 tribes of Israel. And the book closes, if you remember last Sunday, with Joseph and his family. And then if we would have continued on into Exodus, who would have been, if you were to ask class, who is the main character of the book of Exodus? What do most people say? Moses, yeah, right? Most people would say Moses is the main character of the book of Exodus. Moses is born. He spends 40 years in Egypt in Pharaoh's house. That's a pretty good chunk of his formative years. Moses is raised as an Egyptian. In fact, Moses is actually, a lot of people don't know this, but Moses is actually an Egyptian name, not a Hebrew name. He's raised in Pharaoh's house, one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the entire world at the time. How many of you years ago watched the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston? Yeah, most of us at some point in our life have seen the Ten Commandments movie, so you kind of all see how that went down through the movie. After 40 years, Moses decides that he no longer wants to be called Egyptian. He wants to be a Hebrew. He wants to live with his people. But something happened. What happens? Remember, he did something. He killed somebody, right? He killed somebody. He's banished. He's exiled. And then he goes to live for 40 years in the land of Midian. That's right, in the land of Midian. Then he meets his wife, marries her, and becomes a shepherd for his father-in-law's flock. He's there for 40 years. And after that 40-year time frame, remember, he sees a burning what? Burning bush. And at that burning bush, he gets the commission to go back to Egypt and free God's people. Moses' life is like 3 40-year periods here on your screen. 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and 40 years leading God's people in the wilderness. When Moses gets to the cusp of the promised land, He has been working for the Lord for 40 years. He takes his people on a journey that, in all realistic expectations, should have only taken about 6 months. Okay? Should have only taken about 6 months, maybe a year at the most, but it takes them 40 years because of the hardness of their hearts, because they were a stiff-necked generation. Moses gets to the cusp of the promised land, but what happens? Doesn't get to go in. So God has to choose somebody to succeed Moses. Who is that? That's right. Joshua. Joshua leads the people over the Jordan River. They go into the land of Canaan. They conquer the land. Joshua holds the people together for quite a while until his passing. There's a problem, though. Who does God appoint to succeed Joshua after he dies? Who did God appoint to succeed Joshua, after his passing? Who was that? It's a trick question. There's no one. For 40 years, they had Moses, this key figure, centralized figure who they could look to for leadership. Moses dies. Joshua takes over. For decades, they say, who's your leader now? Joshua. Then Joshua dies, and there is no one to point to anymore. What happens is you see these tribes do what they were intended to do. Take the land according to their tribes, instead of having one centralized figure who rules over all these individuals. You have these 12 tribes. And God said, this is going to be your land. These are going to be your boundaries. Part of Joshua's job was to break these things into sections and say, like, for instance, okay, Manasseh. We studied, Manasseh, right? Manasseh, this is your land. Or Dan, this is your land. He breaks it all up. Some of the tribes wanted to pick out land on the eastern side of the Jordan River, of the Dead Sea. You have these different tribes. On the cusp of those tribes in the southwest, of course, you have the Philistines. They're trying to take this land where Judah and Simeon are supposed to be. You've got the Moabites, you've got the Amalekites, you've got these other lands around them that, to be quite honest with you, class, are not super happy that the Israelites have come out of Egyptian captivity, Egyptian slavery, and started taking over what was originally theirs. And that's going to be a problem for quite some time. As we go in this class from judge to judge, we'll zoom in on which area it pertains to. What you see here on screen, and again, we'll print out these maps and things if you'd like them, is a map of the Israelite tribes and the judges who ruled over these specific areas. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say that judges ruled over Israel. I never said that judges ruled over Israel, because there was never, in the time of the judges, a judge that ruled over all of Israel. There was never a time where one guy was over all of Israel. Even guys that we think, as we study, are super impressive, that we know about, men like Gideon and Samson, they never had jurisdiction over a large area of land, and especially not the entire nation. What you have here on your screen is these little pockets. In fact, many times, class, when you see that fighting that takes place between these individuals, they don't call all the tribes of Israel to fight with them. They would maybe call 2 or at the most 3. They don't call everybody. Why is that? Well, honestly, class, if I'm just being frank with you, they don't just fight enemies. They end up fighting one another. It's a sad reality. These different tribes were just as likely to fight against each other as they are with somebody else on the outskirts of their boundaries. That was just a reality for this situation. Not a whole lot of unity, not a whole lot of love between these various tribes. And, you know, you can, as we study this, you're going to be able to see how they were dispersed through these 400 years. But a lot of this is our historical background. What we're doing this morning is just introducing this book. So a lot of the historical background. Now let's talk about the author and date of Judges. Fact is, we don't know. We don't know who exactly wrote was the author of the book of Judges, and we don't know exactly when it was written. But the best that we can tell, according to what it says in the book of Judges, it is that it was written at the time of the monarchy, okay? The monarchy, excuse me. We can say from, for instance, chapter 17 and verse 6, chapter 18 and verse 1, chapter 19 and verse 1, and chapter 21 and 25, we can see this fact of the monarchy, okay? This means it had to be written sometime between 1050 BC. It means, I would say it has to be written after that. Why would it have to be written that if it's during the time of the monarchy? Because what happens in 1050 BC? Does anybody know? That's right. Saul becomes king. So if it's written during the time of monarchy, it's got to be after 1050 BC. It's also got to be before 1004, because in 1004, that's when David takes Jerusalem, we know, from the Jebusites. If you study that, it tells us that the Jebusites controlled Jerusalem, so it's got to be written before that takes place. You have bookends basically here. So it's got to be after 1050, and it's got to be before 1004, somewhere between Saul's reign and David's reign. We'll talk about this later on in Judges chapter 21, but it seems to me anyway, there are some what I would refer to as anti-Saul, pro-David kind of subliminal messages in the text, which would make you think it's probably closer to maybe 1025 or 1020. David takes the throne and the kingdom away from Saul after the death of Saul, or maybe even while Saul was, pursuing David. It's a little deep. We'll get back to that later on. Why this is also important, and why I'm telling you this, is because for a very, very long time, church family, scholars who looked at the book of Joshua and Judges would say, this is all just a bunch of make-believe. This they refer to as the Jewish version of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And, of course, you think about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, you think of Camelot, right? In case you didn't know, King Arthur, Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, there's no historical evidence whatsoever that ever took place. No historical evidence whatsoever. Now, there's a huge debate going on still to this day between people who live in England and historians whether these were real individuals or not. Was there really, in history, a King Arthur? It's been debated for centuries. For a long time, scholars said this is just the Jewish King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, because for a long time there was no archaeological evidence whatsoever for any of these guys, or even that the Israelites were ever in the territory when this took place, which is why this is really important. We had, for a long time, no evidence to confirm that the Israelites ever lived in Canaan until something came along called the Merneptah Stele, okay? And I'll show this to you on the screen here. This particular evidence was dated to the late 13th century, which is going to be, as it says on screen, around the 1290s BC. You have the Amarna letters. I'll also show those on the screen here, which are Egyptian letters from the 14th century, which describe all this widespread fighting with no singular ruler, which sounds a whole lot like what the Bible talks about with the time of the judges. Here you have these letters and this stele written between Amenhotep IV and others, and they talk about how Egypt took what they wanted from this region because there was this whole bunch of small tribes that fought amongst themselves, and there was no centralized at that time power or ruler. And for those of us who read the book of Judges, well, you would say, well, that sounds a whole lot like the time period that is talked about within the book of Judges. So it's important for us to know this historical aspect. Here we have a depiction or a picture of Amenhotep IV, okay, which is also referred to many times as, and forgive me my pronunciation of this, Akhenaten, okay? You notice the hieroglyphics there on your screen, the Egyptian hieroglyphics you see on the Merneptah stele, written in Egyptian hieroglyphics. If you want to see what that says, I'll tell you. It says, the foreign chieftains lie prostrate, saying Shalom, which is Hebrew. Canaan is plundered, Askelon is carried off, and Gezer is captured. Yanom is made into non-existence, Israel is wasted, its seed is not, and Haru is become a widow because of Egypt. Those who went about are subdued by the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, that's significant because when we were able to make this discovery, to find this stele, all of a sudden, all these naysayers that said, well, this is just some mythological Jewish invention, this mythological Jewish version of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they all had, when this was discovered, they all had to take a step back and say, okay, well, wow, now there's this archaeological evidence that shows that Israel was indeed in the territory of Canaan. And what the Bible says about there being this territory with a bunch of chieftains and no centralized ruler is actually there. So thanks to all this archaeology in the last 100 years or so, especially the last 100 years, we have found so many things, class, that validates what the Bible actually has to say. For instance, in 2018, they found a seal belonging to Isaiah the prophet, the first ever extra-biblical witness to Isaiah found of him being a real historical character. Skeptics for, say, 500 years would say you can't trust the Bible because Isaiah's not a real person. And then underneath this bakery shop in Israel, a seal that was over 2,500 years old was discovered, maybe 2,600 years maybe, discovered that belonged to Isaiah the prophet. And it's like those skeptics had to say, oh snap, never mind. It is evidence. You have, if Eperu of the Aramean letters is to be identified with Israel, it is only generic, I would say, and not in specific terms. The earliest clear reference to Israel in history in the extra biblical record is what I shared with you earlier, the Merneptah stele, which is dated at 1205 BC. And that is very, very important. And you see on the screen there is a depiction of the sarcophagus of Merneptah, of that particular pharaoh. Now let me just stop here for a minute because I'm covering a lot of history and things that maybe you've never heard or thought about before. Let me just stop and be honest with you, class. Judges. The book of Judges. I'll tell you, class, it's a very misleading title. Whenever we think of a judge, what do we think of, class? You tell me. You think of some guy wearing what? A long black kind of cloak, right? And what does they usually have in their hand? A gavel. And what do? They execute judgment, right? 25 to life, right? Or whatever you have, right? But really, that's not a very good translation because it gives us the wrong sense of who these men really were. Instead of being judges themselves, they didn't have court in a certain sense. These were men who were executing God's judgments, okay? They weren't making their own judgments. They were executing God's judgments rather than declaring God's judgment. These men, every one of these men came, if you study, we're going to see this, they all came from fascinating backgrounds. These were not the best characters. When you read the book of Judges, and we're going to, you're going to find out these are rough characters. These are not priests who were just super zealous about Yahweh and about the land of Canaan. Sometimes you've got individuals who worship pagan gods, but God is going to use them to execute justice and judgment on the foreign nations that surround the tribes of Israel, and also on those in Israel who are being unfaithful to Yahweh. The judges are more deliverers than they are legal functionaries. They're not really declaring judgment as much as they're, as I said, executing judgment. Sometimes we just get the wrong idea. If you've never studied this, you just kind of get the wrong idea about who these guys were and what their responsibilities were and what they really were as a whole. Although these judges would enjoy, I think, great prestige, and they did enjoy some great prestige, a judge, please understand this, was not a king. His authority was neither absolute, nor was it permanent, and it wasn't hereditary either. You know how sometimes we see later on in the Bible these hereditary kingships, right? These individuals, although they were able to be popular and, as I said, prestigious, they weren't really rulers. We'll have passages later on talking about men like Gideon, where the people were faithful all the time that he lived. But don't take that and think, well, Gideon was some sort of king or something like that, because he really wasn't. He's more like what you would think of as a chief in a Greek or a Canaanite city-state. We don't realize this, but I'm going to tell you this, class. Centralized powers are still relatively a new thing. we don't think about it this way because we've lived under it for so long. But the idea of having large centralized bodies of government in our world history is a relatively new concept. It's so new, in fact, that it wasn't even really what our founding fathers had in mind for the United States when we were first formed. It was made originally to be a confederacy where the main authority laid with the states more so than the centralized government. And if you don't believe me in that, ever since the founding of the United States, you had these individuals who were known as Federalists and individuals who were not. And basically the idea is an argument. What's going to be stronger? The state or the centralized government? Of course, we know who eventually won that. Centralized government, right? Most people would say before the Civil War, even in the North, people thought of themselves like, let me see if I can explain this to you. People thought of themselves as first and foremost belonging to the state versus belonging to the nation. Okay? For instance, you might say, I'm an American, but I'm really a Texan. Today, we wouldn't say that, would we? We'd say, I live in Texas, but I am an American. Well, back then, for many, many years, it was the opposite. You didn't say, I'm an American. No, you said, I'm a Texan who lives in America. So it's kind of swapped. Like I grew up in Alabama, right? I would have said, if I lived back in that day, I would have said, I'm an Alabamian, and I live in America. But after the Civil War ended, guess what happened to that? Just dissipated. Germany and Italy, when you study that, they would not be unified countries until the late 1800s. They're the last two modern countries in Europe we know to be formed. And even in the 1880s, when you study that, you had countries like Italy and Germany that were still, even in that day, being ruled by what was known as city-states. When you think of this time of in history, think of these city-states, kind of like ancient Greece, where you had the Lacedaemonians with the Spartans, you had the Athenians, you had the Macedonians, you had all these different city-states that were really rivals with one another. And within that, you had different leaders and different customs and different dialects. And this, by comparison, state is what Israel looks like in the time of Judges. It's a little different, though, because some of the judges overlapped. Sometimes these judges ruled at the same time as other judges. We'll see that as we study this. You think, Jonathan, how is that even possible? How can you have judges ruling at the same time? Well, different places, different tribes. And it's important for us to keep that in our mind as we study this. If these things are not as unified as maybe you come into this study thinking, we do not have, at this point in time, a unified Israel. In fact, if you look at the history of the Old Testament, I'll just tell you this, if you look at the history of the Old Testament, there's never really been a unified Israel. Even when David is king, the tribes in the north, let me tell you, they didn't like David too much. They only put up with David because David went in there and kind of socked it to him a little bit. They never really had this cohesion. As I said earlier, the tribes were just as likely to fight one another as they were to band together and fight against the enemies. All right. This is important for you to have. And again, if you would email me or the office, we will forward these on to you. Here is in chronological order a listing of all the judges. I don't know if this thing, there it is, That actually works, hey. So you can see this 400-year time frame, and we'll go through and talk about each one of these judges as we study together the biblical text over the next 13 weeks. The dates are here on this screen. I'll tell you, we're not too sure about Shamgar, but because of what takes place, we fit him in between Deborah and the others. And then we have the rest of those. And of course, the last one on our list is Samson. All ruling together, by the way, those last three that you see, Elon, Abdon, and Samson, all ruled at about the same period of time. So there's really, I mentioned overlap, there's definite overlap between those last three judges. All right, the next thing I want to talk about as we introduce this book is the reference to Baal. When you see the land of Israel, these 12 tribes, when we open up the book of Judges next week, let me just ask you, how many of you ever studied the book of Judges? Those of you that have, how were these 12 tribes, how are the people of Israel doing at the time we open up the book of Judges? How are they doing? Not too good at all. Are they good? No, in fact, they're pretty bad. In fact, the Bible has a phrase. When the book of Judges opens up, it's a very popular phrase. What is that phrase? Does anybody recall what that phrase is? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, right? You get this time frame. The closest thing I can compare it to is just martial law, okay? It's just martial law. Just every man for himself. It's just crazy when you read it. The question you might ask is, Jonathan, how did it get so bad? Because, man, when we finished up Genesis, right, we had Jacob with his sons, and everybody's on the same page. We've got, Joseph, and now there's love in the family, and we're going to separate all these tribes, and they're just going to be great friends, and everything's going to be great, right? Something had to happen, right? How did it get so bad? You think about it. You've got God who leads the children of Israel out of bondage from Egypt, the most powerful nation on the earth. He leads them for 40 years. He's with them when they take the land of Canaan against all these, warring nations who were full of great warriors and fighters, and all we had was a bunch of farmers. And guess who won? A bunch of farmers. Beat a valiant nation of warriors, right? God's with them. And then you fast forward about 100 years, it's all dissipated. The reason why is that the individuals who were taking the land of Canaan didn't fully listen to God. What did God say? God said, wipe them out. Don't let any marry. Don't take their customs. Don't take on their religion. And when you open up the book of Judges, you're going to see that idolatry is rampant everywhere, from Judges chapter 1 to Judges chapter 21. Even with some of the judges themselves, these individuals, they took the land, yes, but they adopted all these Canaanite customs, and they adopted all these Canaanite religions. Of course, Baal is one that we're going to see. Now, who is Baal? Well, Baal was the head god in the Canaanite religion. It's 2 syllables. It's mentioned 70 times in the Old Testament. And his name, Baal, means master or Lord. He was the primary god of the Canaanites because he was I'm going to put it to you, a weightier deity. Okay? You might know why you would pick here, in this case, he was also a weather deity. What does it mean to be a weather deity? You control the weather, that's right. And in an agricultural society, it's important to have a God who's sending you what you need, right? It's a very big agricultural place. Rain is extremely important. If we can have food, we can take care of everything else. Baal is the chief Canaanite god. You'll see Baal with different names, by the way. Baal Peor or Baal Hermon. There are dozens of names for God in the Old Testament. You'll see different names. If you were in Carrie's class, you saw names like God the Comforter, God the Provider. You'll see those various types of things. Baal, though, was extremely important in Canaanite religion. You see that description of Baal on the screen there? Has in his hand, on one side, he has the anvil. It's up. He was the one that would bring the rain. He would bring the thunder. But we're not done yet, because then you have Asherah. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Asherah was the wife of Baal, the chief Canaanite god. Many people out there today don't know the difference between monotheism, polytheism, and henotheism, okay? Most people that you're going to talk to don't know the difference between monotheism, polytheism, and henotheism. Monotheism is a belief in how many gods? One. Polytheism is the belief in how many gods? Many. What were the Canaanites? Well, oftentimes, they were polytheism. They were polytheistic. Guess what? They're not. They were not polytheistic people. They were henotheists, which is the idea that you have one chief God and many other smaller gods. So remember that. Polytheists believe that all these gods, you have many gods, but they're all equal. Henotheism believes you have one major God and then all these little gods. Okay? There you go. Many times when you're growing up, maybe in 5th or 6th grade, people would say, all the different Roman and Greek gods, that they were polytheist. They weren't. They were henotheist. They believed in one big God who would be what? Zeus. But that's really the way it is here. You got one big God and all these little gods from all around. So that's kind of got what you've got going on here, right? Asherah is the wife. Does anybody know what she was known as, Asherah? She was the goddess of fertility. The goddess of fertility. She represents birth and motherhood and nurturing in nature. She was the wife of Baal. One of her epithets was that she was the mother of 70 gods. I don't know how they come up with this stuff back then, but she was a fertility goddess. Here's the interesting thing. Let me ask you something, class. You ever known of cultures to integrate and mix different things? The cultures ever integrate and mix various things? Sure do. One of the interesting things is that we know that the Israelites, one of the things they did when they entered Canaan, they kept Yahweh. Oftentimes we think, they get in Canaan, they just forsook Yahweh. No, they never forsook Him in the fact of giving Him up. That never happened. You look at the archaeological evidence, they didn't give Yahweh up. What did they do instead? They just mixed in and inserted the Canaanite religion. Guess who became the wife of Yahweh? In the Israelite culture, guess who became the wife of Yahweh? Asherah. Isn't that weird? in ancient Israelite religion at the time of the judges, Yahweh, our God, had a wife. He was just the chief God. He was the more powerful God. So, oh yeah, you got gods? You have Canaanite gods. We got a God too. Maybe your gods are real, but ours are more stronger. So he can be the king over your gods. Problem is, that's not the way God wanted to be worshiped. And that's not the way God set up in the Old Testament to be seen, right? God doesn't want to be seen as the big God and there's a bunch of little bitty gods. That's not the way God wants to be seen. How does God want to be seen, class? The one true and living God. All others are fake. We can see from the descriptions of this time period, for instance, you have Kirbet el-Kom, okay? Kirbet el-Kom and Kuntilet el-Jrad, okay? These are things that have been discovered that portray in that time period that the Israelites had, again, intermingled and intermarried and taken on these aspects of the Canaanite religion, for instance, Asherah. And you have this evidence of that time period that Israelites that saw God as Yahweh but thought Yahweh had a wife. And like, for instance, on your screen, you have this bench tomb that had an inscription. And then within that inscription, you may call it graffiti. You also have pottery here at Kirbet el-Kom. But this bench tomb that you see on your screen dates back to about the 8th century. As I mentioned here on the screen, it's probably the same site as the biblical Makeda. And the inscription on that tomb right here says this: for Uriah the governor, his inscription, blessed is Uriah by Yahweh. From his enemies he has been saved by his what? Asherah. I mentioned Kuntilet el-Jrad, which is basically pottery. And on this pottery, you have a depiction of Yahweh as the big bull, okay? And standing before him, you have two individuals. Well, guess who's in the background? Asherah, the supposed wife of Yahweh. In multiple occasions, class, you have this depiction of Asherah that's found in places that were inhabited by the Israelites. You have this idea of Israelites that basically intermingled, inserted Canaanite religion into Yahweh and Yahweh into Canaanite religion. And that's important. You may say, Jonathan, why are you telling us all this? Oftentimes, class, we think that the Israelites in the time of Judges just forsook God altogether. And we don't see a parallel when we study this between the Israelites of the Old Testament and us today in New Testament Christianity, because we think, well, we've never forsook God like that. We've never done anything like that. We've misled ourselves. The real problem, class, is that the Israelites, they had God. God said, you're supposed to be, when you get in this land of Canaan, what are you supposed to be? Holy, different. Then they got to the land of Canaan, and guess what? They weren't holy, and they weren't any different than the people they lived around. What does Jesus tell us we as Christians are supposed to do today? You got to be holy. You got to be different. Remember, he said salt and light. Oftentimes, many Christians think, well, as long as I believe in God, as long as I believe in Jesus, as long as I say I've obeyed Jesus, then it doesn't matter how I live. Really? When you do that, class, I'm telling you, you may look at this and say, how would these people be so foolish as to adopt these Canaanite gods like Baal and Asherah? Why were they so dumb to do stuff like this and integrate in the Canaanite religion? And we would never do anything like that. Are you serious? Because guess what? History repeats itself. Today it's so easy to find Christians who are doing the exact same thing that people did on the day of Judges. The days of Judges, what does it say? Everyone did what? What was right in their own eyes. I submit to you as we close this class this morning, in 21st century Christianity, guess what? Everyone is doing what? What is right in their own eyes, except the biggest difference is, guess what? They didn't have a king. What do we have? We have the one King. Shall have no other gods before me, right? Have no other Lord than the Lord, your Savior, Jesus Christ. As we read and study the book of Judges, I want to close to this class. Don't think about this as, well, these things took place over 3,000 years ago, so they mean nothing to me. I think it's easy to do that. I don't think people have changed very much over the last 3,000 or so years. I don't think so. I think what oftentimes we struggle with is what they struggled with. Being different, being holy, following God's Word. And I think oftentimes even in the church today, maybe today we are more and more like our ancestors in the faith than we would ever dare to claim. All right, that's our class. Thank y'all for walking through this introduction. We'll get into our text next Sunday morning. I hope you learned something. I've learned a lot in preparing for this class and looking forward to sharing it with you as we go forward. Thank y'all very much. Let's close with a prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for this class as we begin this journey together. Father, I know there's a lot to this, and we've talked about a lot and analyzed a lot, but Father, be with us that we'll soak it in, and if we have questions, we'll ask, and Father, be informed about the environment of the time of the Judges and what was really taking place so that we can understand your word better. Be with us as we leave here now. Bring us back, Father, this evening, and give us an opportunity to worship and praise you even more. So, Jesus, that we pray. Amen. Thank y'all.